Awesome. Okay. So because we are recording tonight, I wanted to let you all know before we get started, we are going to try and make this video available on our Facebook page as well as a YouTube video. So if there are points where you might miss, or if you want to let other friends know and want to share the video, you're more than welcome to. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Moroni to open us with a quick prayer.
Thank you, Jolene, and Ed also thank you for coming and joining us this evening. However you want to prepare yourself a prayer, just do so. Diné. Holy people, Creator, we are grateful to be gathered together with a common interest and desire to bring peace and to eliminate violence and to bring healing to our communities. Father, holy people, we pray that as we go through this conversation, that our minds and our hearts will be open and that we'll understand what healing means and what each of us should be doing so that we can heal ourselves and our families, our land, and all those who may have been forgotten and have fallen to the cracks of this crisis. Holy people, Creator, we ask that you guide us and open our minds and fill our minds with peace as we move forward, and give us the strength and the desire and the courage to continue to help those who have been forgotten, who are not seen, that we may lift them and bring them to a place of healing. And we pray for these things, holy people. Thank you.
Yeah, Moroni, I really appreciate that and being able to provide that before we start our forum. And I think starting it in a good way like that is really important. So I want to welcome everyone to the Missing and Murdered Diné Relatives Virtual Forum. This is going to be a panel discussion that will create conversation around domestic violence as a contributing factor to the missing and murdered crisis on the Navajo Nation. This discussion is important because we want to highlight intersecting issues that are relevant to our Navajo people and to also create awareness around domestic violence. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and it is important to center our survivors, their stories, and how we can help support them as a community. Additionally, we want to find solution-based pathways to foster healing throughout the Navajo Nation. MMDR is a community-based task force comprised of volunteers from various backgrounds, such as leadership, community members, researchers, injury prevention specialists, advocates, and college students. We seek to understand the dynamics that contribute to the missing and murdered crisis and to create a space for families to elevate their voices so they are heard. Our 5 action teams are currently working to establish a data institute, complete a community action toolkit, create awareness, and advocate at the tribal, state, and federal levels to bring resources and awareness around these issues that are affecting our Navajo communities. It's been a hard journey for us. However, we are thankful to have our sister organization, Navajo Nation Missing Persons Updates. With their support and knowledge, they have helped guide our work and connect us with families in need of help. You can follow them on Facebook and Instagram, and that slide will be shown here later in the forum. I would also like to highlight some amazing tribal coalitions who have been engaged in movement building and working hard to protect our women, children, and most vulnerable. They work every day to fight violence in tribal communities and to educate folks about the impacts of violence. I am going to change this here. The first organization I want to highlight is Battered Family Shelter. And I just want to let you know these first 3 points are direct service providers who are able to help families who may be in crisis, who may be experiencing domestic violence. They do serve areas near and on the Navajo Nation, and that is the Battered Family Shelter, Northern Treehouse Shelter, and Adabi Healing Shelter. Other coalitions that are also engaged in domestic and sexual violence prevention is the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. I'm actually the training and education director there, and it is a collective of amazing individuals engaged in incredible work. And also want to have a shout out to our sister coalitions, Restoring Ancestral Winds, who are based out of Utah, and they do incredible work, especially in the realm of MMIWG and LGBTQI2S issues. And then our other sister coalition is the Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition, who is also making a lot of headway on the Arizona side. Other resources that you can also tap into is the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. If you are experiencing domestic violence, or you want to, and you might not be, this isn't just Navajo specific, but if you are a relative out there in Indian country, this is another great resource that you can call, as well as look at their website. And to get more information on how violence impacts communities, you can also check out the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. So with that, I want to introduce Valia Cisco. Valia came to our MMDR organization very recently, and we're very happy to have Valia here with us tonight to introduce a really important campaign that we're working on, that we are kicking off tonight, that we're really excited about. So I'll go ahead and turn the time to Valia.
Thank you, Jolene. Yate, my name is Valia Cisco. Kia Ani Nishle, Bizaklana Bashishchin, the Bethlejina Dashache, and Flowing Water Dashinale. I come from Oak Springs, Arizona. My parents are the late Jacqueline Whitman and the late Walter B. Gay. My grandparents are Jackie Chischilly and the late Alcie Chischilly of Oak Springs, Arizona, as well as Guy and Frances B. Gay from Gallup, New Mexico. I am the second oldest of 7 children and a mother to 2 children. First off, I just want to say thank you to everyone that has made the time today to join us and to be a part of this forum. Kaczynski Ariel B. Gay was my oldest sister. In July 2017, she had went missing. My family and I searched effortlessly to find her and to bring her home. We searched every single day for 3 months until October 15th. That's when her remains were discovered near the Carino Canyon Bridge, just 22 miles from where she lived with our mother, grandfather, and younger siblings. During the time she was missing, we followed every single lead that came to us, either through social media, calls, or text messages. We were desperate. We knew that something was wrong, and we knew that she needed our help, and we needed to find her. My sister wasn't the type to go and disappear without any explanation. Months prior to her disappearance, she was a victim of domestic violence, and she was struggling with healing. But even so, she always made sure to tell someone where she was going or what she was going through. She, of course, would have called me to let me know that she needed time to herself. So knowing that in the beginning of her disappearance, how none of our calls were being answered or how we weren't getting any replies from our texts to her worried us more, especially how she wasn't active on her social media account. My sister was truly a beautiful person inside and out, and she was always willing to give a helping hand to anyone and everyone. She mostly cared especially for her family, the veterans of Oak Springs community, and of course the elders of the Oak Springs community. During the time she was employed with the Oak Springs chapter, she always went out of her way to work one-on-one with every community member that walked in. When big winter storms hit, she would literally live at the chapter house, making sure that food was being delivered and roads to high-risk elders were being plowed. There was a time when she was employed with Oak Springs and my grandfather's car wouldn't make it out of the residence, so she walked the 2.5 miles to the chapter house, and she posted a picture on her social media with her hair frozen and frosted. Even her eyelashes and her eyebrows were frosted. That's how dedicated she was to the community of Oak Springs. During meetings, you would always hear whispers in the crowd such as, "Oh, that Ariel. She was always so happy and always helps me with whatever I need. And she laughs too loud and is always smiling." Ariel was never the kind to shake your hand, but rather give you a tight, big hug no matter who you were. The the kind of hug that always made your problems disappear. She took the time to remember little details of every person she met. For my sister Ariel, she was always my main supporter in anything I did. She never liked to see me sad or upset. She pushed me to follow my dreams. She never stood by and watched me struggle. She always made sure that I was okay, and if I wasn't, she would never leave until I was. She would make corny jokes until I laughed or smiled. I never took her love and support for granted. I always made sure to tell her how important she was to me. We always used to tell each other, "I love you, Sissy, from here to there, endlessly, always and forever." That's why seeking justice for her is so important to me, because she deserves it. My sister's disappearance and unjustified murder has deteriorated my life, but over the months, I've learned to adjust. It has been a struggle, but what makes me push forward is I have a thing that I call Ariel's light. Since then, I've been trying to live a bright life as my sister did. How she was always there to help, to give, to show support, and to be content in life. To live by faith, to never hold grudges, and always be forgiving. She smiled her way through anything. And like I said, she never allowed me to be sad in life. She always told me she didn't like to see me cry. So when things go dark, I always try to imagine her voice telling me, "I'm okay, yeah." I would also like to say that this virtual campaign, Miles for Ariel, is not only to shine more light on her disappearance and murder, but for more families to tell their loved ones' stories, to remind them that they are not alone, and to never allow their loved ones' light to ever go dim. To continue to say their names and to never give up hope, and that their loved ones return home soon and safely, to continue to fight for justice for the loved ones ripped away. This virtual campaign, Miles for Ariel, is also to recognize the pain and heartache of domestic violence, as October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Thank you for your time, and I hope many of you choose to partake in running, walking, hiking, or biking for Miles for Ariel. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you all. This all wouldn't have been possible without the hard and loving dedication work of missing and murdered Diné relatives, Jolene, and Navajo Nation Missing Persons Update, and their compassion towards this serious crisis. And thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much for that, Valia. Your sister's story really touched us. And when we started to plan out this forum and how much it meant to you, as well as other families, we hope we did it justice. And of course, the support and love, you have all of that from us. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And the space here we created for families. And I want to encourage others who would like to engage in campaigns or events, feel free to reach out to us. Whatever capacity we have, we want to make sure that we share that with you and that you have a chance to be heard, that you have a chance to make these issues visible because they are important to you. But at the same time, it's a process of healing. So thank you, Valia. One thing that we are also including, this is posted on our Instagram as well as our Facebook page. So for this Miles for Ariel, some of the steps that to participate is we want to encourage folks to run, walk, bike, wheel your miles, and feel free to be as creative as you'd like. And for our relatives who are differently abled, feel free to also participate. You can incorporate movements such as, if you're like chair exercises or leg and arm exercises, feel free to share that with us as well. And please utilize these hashtags because when we click on the hashtags, it's going to help us track exactly who's participating. And also we want to let you know that we're also going to be sending you some swag, some MMDR buttons, stickers, masks, and handkerchiefs. And there is a chance to, if you're able to register, again, this is all on our social media pages. Fill out that registration form and you'll be entered into a raffle for a prize at the end of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So understanding that we also want to make sure that we're being intentional in awareness, we would also encourage our participants to answer some prompts, and those prompts are laid out there in the steps. For instance, one of the prompts there is, what will you do to spread awareness and domestic violence about Ariel or relatives who have gone missing or murdered? And we would love to read your stories. If you feel like you're ready to share that in a very public way, we're here to listen and we're here to elevate your voice. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and jump into the panel discussion. I will call on the panelists to introduce themselves just in the order that I see them on the screen. So to my very left is Sheda Janine Yazi.
Thank you, dear relatives, for inviting me to be a part of this important discussion today. Shea Janine Yazi and Shea Tinan Janine Shlento Toda Chitni Bashichin, Netlana Shichedo Dilkai Shanella, Tessa Anna de Nashak de Na Joja de Shahoan, Nakil China dat Shaholo, Alkut Al Diné Stanin Shle. And so it's an honor to be here, and I'm really looking forward to what we're going to be sharing and the questions that we'll be getting from the community so we can move this work forward. Thank you.
Great, and right next to you, Janine, is Mesky.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you guys all for joining us this evening. My name is Miss Kiana Bayatsati. Miss Kiana Bayatsati Inashia, Nanish Ejanishlan, Thunderband, Perry Van Potawatomi Bashashin, Hatswa Deshichedo, Chichimeka Nakai Dashanella. I'm originally from Oklahoma, but I do live near Sayanichi, New Mexico, proud member of the Church Rock chapter, and also a member of Navajo MMDR and the founder of Navajo Nation Missing Persons. I want to thank Jolene for inviting me to be on one of the panelists here, and I'm looking forward to this because we do need a lot more forums to go on. We do need to keep up with what's going on with our organizations and, you know, let all of you know, our followers know what's going on, and just let you know that we're still being active, although this pandemic is here. And again, all the panelists, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, Sheda, thank you. Very privileged and honored to introduce this next panelist, Sheda Amber Kinesbakrati.
Oh, yat e kia ani nesle do bilagana bashichin, deschini de shachedo bilagana de chanela. Shay Amber Kinesbakrati, Yanisha Tohatsoi the Nacha. So I'm Delegate Amber Kinesbakrati. I'm a Navajo woman, a mother, community member, and we're here together collectively to strengthen our voice and to advocate for the victims of violence, and most importantly, hearing the stories from the families as we all try to heal together. All of us have been impacted with a missing relative, and so I appreciate the safe space that we're creating today. So and thank you, Shiaj, for your beautiful prayer and setting the tone.
And with that, Moroni.
Yeah, nanat Arnold so she Moroni Benali in shit. Na shashin and shlindo, but ani bashes chindo, toachane dashichedo, trabahi dashanella. I used to totally content nasha. At lay Salt Lake City, a shahuan ado, restoring ancestral winds with yegi a banashnish. Adi coordinator for policy and advocacy, a shananish. And I just wanted to say thank you, everyone. I'm humbled and honored to be with all of you. All of the work I've known all of you in different capacities for a number of years, and I'm thrilled to actually be sitting among you in this panel because So for those who don't understand, I work for Restoring Ancestral Winds. We're a tribal coalition, one of the 18 tribal coalitions funded through the Office of Violence Against Women, and we're based out of Salt Lake City. And our organization works with the 8 tribes in the Great Basin area. So we spend a lot of time with the Navajo Nation for a number of reasons. So grateful to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, Shania. Ado Shada, Kim Smith.
Oh, yat a shik a do shidana do a yaha shia shmaronai nitsidizin njana do ado at a shik a yat a she a Kim Smith dashijine to the cheatney nishli do tina dini bashish chin a she dashiche do kia ani dashanale a quit out the nest and nishli Deek ad alay tzedak ande adenashado shagondo shananish. Good evening, relatives. My name is Kim Smith. I am a citizen scientist living and working in the Hogback area, looking at the effects of living near a coal mine and coal-fired power plants. What we're doing is we're studying what types of health impacts they have, not only on ourselves, but also the land and our people. I'm very honored to be here, and my hands go up to each of you for the work that each of you do. It's very inspiring, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, Shada. And last but not least, Pat.
Yat e she e Pat Nelson Yanishia, Kachini Nishle, do Tobahe Basis Chin, Ado Senajini das che do na Clayton Edashanale. Good evening, everybody. Just like everybody said, it's definitely an honor to be a part of this panel. Thank you, Ms. Key, for reaching out to me and the MMDR team. You guys all do amazing work, so thank you for letting me be a part of this.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us tonight. It's really incredible and an honor for MMDR to have such a robust panel here that's going to answer some of these questions, but also to encourage our thought processes and start to create these conversations within our communities, because it's incredibly important. And also, you know, we have a lot more questions than we do have answers, and this is definitely an opportunity for us to address that. So I am going to go ahead and jump into the first question. Feel free if you want to jump in. This first question is, how does domestic violence contribute to the missing and murdered crisis? And what do you think is needed in our community to address this issue? And we can start with Shada Delegate Crotty.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So I think what we have to unpackage is what we consider domestic violence. And when we close our eyes and think about who's the individual who is experiencing violence, is whether it's, you know, whether it's a family member, a relative, or someone that they're in a relationship with. And I think at any age and in any person, whether it's someone who identifies as a cisgendered woman or cisgendered man, or you know, now our LGBTQI community members. The reason why I say this is because when we look at data and how we're coding and how our law enforcement actually enter into some of these cases, we've heard from our relatives where they have called and they've literally been laughed at because it wasn't a social norm, or the officer felt like there wasn't something where like a victim blaming, victim shaming, in terms of if they're suffering through either mental health issues or they're challenged with you know, coping with their trauma through substance. So I think it's a good foundation to say, like, what are we talking about when we're saying domestic violence? I think in terms of how it correlates or intersects with our missing, when we start talking to the family members, Ariel and her sister shared their story, and actually, you know, Ariel was recovering from a severe assault that took place, you know, against her just, you know, a few weeks before she went missing, or a few months. But I think what is also, when we look at some of the other missing individuals, we have a veteran, a woman veteran who's missing, who dedicated her life to the military, and was always, and that's what we hear, is always willing to help, is always out there in the community, a helping hand. And so she was in a relationship with a very violent man, who now we cannot find her, and the family continues to advocate. And so I think as we mine down this data, we'll understand that dynamic. And I think what is important for everyone on the call to understand is we are at a critical point in terms of collecting data on Navajo Nation. Ideally, we would go to a site and you could pull up all the data, you would synthesize it, but that just is not happening. And I think those are some of the areas that I wanted to highlight, that so as we talk about community engagement, community empowerment, those stories of our survivors and their families also have to have that same weight of some of this metrics that we're using for data, so that we could tell their stories, and also do a lot of prevention work, and try to track down, and that could also help us understand what may have happened to this relative who is missing, and who we should continue to go back and investigate and make sure that they were not part of that individual's disappearance. So thank you for the question, and I hope to listen and learn from the rest of the panelists.
I was thinking about this question since I got it, and I think there are three things that I just kind of want to say about this. One is the murdered missing Indigenous, this MMDR crisis is really like a structural, large systemic structural failure. It's a failure on many parts, and one of those failures is a failure to serve and bring justice just to women, Native women in particular, Native trans women, Native girls. But what we're finding out is that even domestic violence, in this entire field of domestic violence, and the response to it has also largely failed women. And it's improving gradually. And so when I think about how domestic violence feeds into that, we have to think about just the structural part of it, but also what our council delegate, Delegate Crotty, talked about in terms of thinking about the different types of violence as well, because domestic violence, it sort of comes in these like two large kind of categories, where domestic violence could be either situational, arising out of a situation, and what we saw, like within this pandemic, we saw empirical numbers increase, the uptick of cases of domestic violence increased in the Navajo Nation during sheltering in place. And what we find is that in this field, most of those were situational, and it arose because people lost their jobs. It arose out of just a whole bunch of things, of stresses, and sometimes these types of violent acts are just, they happen once and they end. But when we think about the second part, which is the more repetitive, the more escalating, the more violent, which is oftentimes the ones that we tend to think about when we think about domestic violence, those are the ones that we also have to think about in terms of the lethality of the type of violence being used against the person. So when we even think about that, and we think about, for example, sorry for this, but strangulation is a key indicator of death. It's a high predictor of death. And so when we think about our relatives who are in some sort of relationship with someone, and they encounter these types of violence, like the domestic violence, that is what the scholars call terrorist violence, terror violence, it really is what they call it. And that's the type of violence that we tend to see tracking and feeding into these cases of murder and missing, this murdered and missing epidemic. But so we have to take a look back. It's like, yeah, it's failed women, but we have to think also about how these structures and the perceptions of these caseworkers and law enforcement workers, how they view and understand Nuglahead, like myself, a Two-Spirit, how they traditionally view us, and whether or not what we say as a violent act is legitimate in their eyes. And women constantly are undergoing this. They are constantly being tested and questioned about anything. Like, for example, even last night, I was at the gym with this friend of mine, and he was like, yeah, some women, maybe not. I'm like, no, 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 no. I want you to get that completely out of your mind, because when we can't start addressing, I mean, there's just so much to this, Jolene, this is a huge question, but I think the three parts is that there's a larger structural failure that allows domestic violence to easily create pathways for one being disappeared and becoming a victim of homicide. But it's also looking at the colonial structures as well, and what they have done to sort of obscure how we even see ourselves sometimes, and whether or not we are worthy of healing. And I think that even gets into these moments of domestic violence. Oftentimes we feel we're worthless and not worthy of that healing. So I think there's a whole bunch involved. Anyways, I'll let others talk.
Yeah, I just want to build off what Shada Amber shared, and also Shania Moroni, Dr. Benali. You know, I really appreciate, Amber, that you brought up that we need to rethink what domestic violence is, because there's so much like ingrained stereotypes around what a victim looks like of domestic violence, but really what we're talking about is violence in the home. And not only is it structural, not only is it situational, it's also historical. We're dealing with the inheritance of cycles of violence and acts of violence that have been conditioned and normalized in our communities against particular vulnerable groups. And this isn't a Native problem. This isn't a Diné problem, even though we're going to be talking a lot about the prevalence of this in our communities. I really want our people to understand that this isn't something we created for ourselves. This is something that is a result of structures and systems of power that continually to layer upon different oppressions and different forms of violence, to the point where people feel, either as an individual or as a society, that your only ability to take back power is through violence. And so when that comes and that happens in our household, or it happens at large, you know, that's where we see these patterns of behavior that is actually harmful, and it's internalizing these cycles of oppression within our homes and within our communities. And that's what we need to break. And because we not only do we not have the legal systems, but we also don't even remember and are perform on a large scale the ceremonies, are bringing the medicines, are the groups of sisters and of aunties and of two-spirit relatives that were able to hold our relatives accountable to the health and safety and well-being of all of our precious members of our communities. And because we don't have those cultural structures, those social structures that our communities relied on when this imbalance and this disharmony and this violence was invited into our homes or in our communities, and we're forced to pit all of our hopes in these systems that were never structured to protect us, that's when we see these cycles not being broken and bleeding out into our children, into their relationships, into how people deal with conflicts with each other, and how this gets normalized generation after generation. A lot of people don't know, but my activism started as a survivor of child sexual abuse. And that was brought into my household along with these other forms of cycles of violence and domestic violence that we were witnessing in our household, not only just between my parents, but between my siblings, between cousins, between aunties and uncles, between grandparents, between the siblings and among our elders. This is how it really takes place in our communities. And unless we can hold that and also bring in those cycles, that really hard love that we've forgotten about and forgotten how to appreciate, to hold each other accountable, we can't break these cycles, but it can be done. But I'll address that later. I'll talk about that later.
Right, I definitely agree with Janine, and we're not naming a lot of these things that we're seeing in our community, like molestation and rape. You know, these are things that are very triggering to our communities because they're so embedded. And, you know, unfortunately, it's not talked about openly in our communities. You know, we're told like Doa Janida, and, you know, so that allows for these cycles to continue rather than catering and having that compassion and that fierce love that Janine is talking about to put this person in ceremony to heal their spirit. And then also that becomes this trickling effect. And, you know, then that healing truly does come alive, and it slows the process and breaks the cycle.
Yeah, most definitely. I agree with everybody on here. And also as a child survivor of, you know, sexual assault and domestic violence, I know that this is a big topic, and it's a big problem on our reservation, even off the reservation. The pandemic has just brought out so much stuff that we, you know, as people living day to day didn't realize was actually happening. And then, you know, I had the conversation with my daughter earlier today because she asked me what we were going to be talking about. And I told her we're going to be talking about domestic violence. And I thought it was a perfect time to sit down and talk to her about what had happened with me, and bringing all the attention that I kind of held inside and told my daughter about. And I wanted her to be mindful and also be aware that there's these things going on. And because she had brought up that one of her classmates had confided in her, and that her situation was her dad was, you know, abusing her and her mother. And of course, it was reported to the police, so that part was taken care of. So this pandemic is bringing out a lot of this mental health issues and a lot more domestic violence cases. And a lot of us are staying at home, so that stress is rising. And again, like what you guys had mentioned, you know, a lot of people are losing their jobs, their stress levels are so high. So there is differences in all domestic violence cases, but it's domestic violence. And you know, this is a cycle that we do have to break. And I told my daughter today that I've been through probably one of the most traumatic things a little girl could ever go through, but I'm breaking this cycle so that I don't pass this on to any of my kids, and I don't want them to learn that. So it starts with us individually. And I know that a lot of us have gone through this and we're experiencing it now, and we've experienced it in our past, but it's up to us to break that. And I know that we're talking a little bit about that. And, you know, let's see. So the other thing about, you know, domestic violence being connected to our missing, that's one of our number one issues with our missing. And it's really sad that it has to be that way, but it is. And even with the situation that I had as a child, that also led to a missing, a murdered in my family. And it's horrible. It's a horrible thing to experience, but a lot of us do. And if not experience it, we know somebody that has gone through it. And you know, our missing, the numbers are rising, and we hit it like a little bump where there's more missing persons cases within these last several months. And it's really hard to see this because, you know, we're used to having numbers fluctuate, but the numbers just going up and up and up. It's really frustrating to see this because we're here to make this awareness happen. And, you know, sometimes it just really feels that, are we doing enough? And I know that a lot of us that live way out on the reservation, one thing that we always say that would help with domestic violence cases is the cell towers. A lot of our relatives are not getting, you know, the coverage. What if they need to make that important phone call to say, hey, you know, we're being abused, we're hiding from my abuser, and they don't have coverage there? What do they do? And our 911 locations, they're not updated. And there's just so many things that we need to change. And we need accurate addresses. I know that was a big issue before this pandemic had hit, that, you know, a lot of our relatives don't have addresses. They're using PO box numbers. So once we make that phone call to police departments and say, hey, we need your assistance here, and they don't have an accurate address, that is a big delay. And that delay in every minute counts for trying to save, you know, a situation like that when it comes to our people that are in domestic violence situations. We also need shelters. We need some more shelters. You know, there's just so many things that we need. And I know this conversation is just, it's just a big question, and there's so many things that we can talk about. We also need a little bit more, we have a leniency on our laws when it comes to domestic violence. They can get tossed in this weekend and they'll be out Monday. And then what happens? That cycle returns again. So then, you know, after the person, that the victim is being abused and they know that their abuser's out, they don't want to call the police again, because what's going to happen? They're just going to be released again so that they can be beat on. So there's just so many things that we can touch base on. And I want to thank you guys for bringing this up. This is something that we really did need to talk about. Thank you.
I wanted to add on to what Amber was saying about, you know, the definition of domestic violence and how she brought that up. You know, on top of the textbook definition of domestic violence, I think as individually, we all have our own definition, and how, you know, that was tethered into what we saw growing up, you know, as survivors and victims, you know, seeing that in childhood and adulthood, and bringing those things up. But also, I think the numbers of, you know, the Native women being murdered by their partners, you know, those numbers are really high. And I think I've been in the domestic violence advocacy for almost a decade now, and I think there are two clients I always think of when I talk about murdered, our murdered relatives and sisters, and both of them were both murdered by their partners, and it's surreal, you know, talking to them 1 second in the ER room. You know, you're talking about your plans for the next day. You know, tomorrow you're going to come in, we're going to do a restraining order, we're going to do all these things, and then you know, hearing a couple hours later they're gone. You know, having their bodies in a bag. So those kind of seeing those, it makes you realize. You know, I think one of the questions that I wanted to answer was, you know, what do we think is needed in the community to address this issue? And I think Ms. Key, you also talked about, you know, how we feel as advocates we're not doing enough. And I think I feel like that a lot, especially those days when I had, you know, those women die. You know, that I think about that every day of, you know, what can I do? And I think just encouraging the community, even if it doesn't seem like what they're doing is significant, it does. It matters to, you know, every woman that walks through the doors, because even for them walking through those doors is hard enough for them. Them acknowledging, you know, that they're in a situation, even how did they get a ride to get there? How did they, you know, that there's so much strength in that for them, and I don't think that's acknowledged enough. Them reaching out for help, and I think those are one of the ways that doesn't just protect clients, but it protects the community. And I think that's something that we need to go back to, and working in different shelters and different programs. I think it's misconstrued. You know, I think a lot of people look for perfect victims, meaning they want the client that listens to all the advice that they give them. Go file a restraining order, go file a police report, go to the hospital, you know. And then when they don't, we don't look at that as, oh, they're standing up for themselves. You know, that's how they speak up for themselves. But yet we're also becoming abusers by telling them what to do. And when they don't do what we tell them to do, we get frustrated. And we're saying, oh, you know, they're not going to listen to us. Why are we even helping them? You know, they're just going to go back. And that's true. You know, it takes more than 8 times for women to leave their abusive partners. But that's where I think we need to understand as a community, and as far as awareness, is we can't be the person to judge them, because they get it so much from family, they get it so much from the community, from everybody, from all points. And so that's one of the things I tell clients when they come into the door. And I think they need to hear that there's no judgment. They need to not just hear it, but they need to really genuinely feel that. And I think why that's important is because it allows them to keep returning. to keep coming back. So that's just something I want to share about that first question.
I have one more thing to add too. Do you want to go first? Okay. I think one of the things that we really need to talk about in our communities is really talking about the history of where Indigenous people have been dealing with this for 500 years. We learned it from the military. We learned it from the police state. You know, these are all learned behaviors, and you know, they stem from churches and boarding schools. You know, these are all things that we have not fully talked about and engaged in this way that we're doing, and we need to do it more. And as a survivor myself, I think that we openly need to talk about abuse. We need to talk about consent, teaching consent, setting boundaries, you know, listening to survivors, because otherwise all of this just continues to be normalized in our communities. But also looking at alcoholism, that's also another huge factor that nobody really seems to really tackle and talk about. When we see how it brings violence into our communities, we see how normalized it is. And you know, it really shows how we're so far behind as Diné people. And it, you know, why don't we have more shelters, more funding to go to shelters? Why don't we have a rehab? Why don't we have these services that are specifically meant to heal our people and to break these cycles and to really unearth these topics so that we can truly figure out how to heal? Because this is all learned behavior and it's all intergenerational trauma. So it's going to take a lot of us digging deep in order to get to the core of everything. And we have to be brave. That's a different type of courageous. It's a different type of bravery, but we have to do it.
Thank you for that. I think all those answers are incredibly giving us a lot to think about, those of us who are here. I just want to give a really quick shout out to our victim advocates. For those who are on our Zoom call, victim advocates are usually the first line when there's a domestic violence incident or any type of incident, even if it's like if a relative goes missing or if a relative is murdered. The victim advocates are there to support the families from that very first step. And that's why it's really incredibly important to think about creating that awareness around domestic violence and really supporting the advocates that are out there that are entrenched in this work and who are incredibly amazing. I feel like advocates are superheroes. And if you want more information, I will post the information for the tribal coalitions, and you can check out their websites and you'll see areas on there that talk about victim advocates and how you can find one within your community. In fact, our coalition victim advocate coordinator, Tiffany Harone, is joining us. So if you have any questions about victim advocates, drop it into the chat and maybe Tiffany can give you a response. So going on to the next question. What challenges can be named that have made services to DV survivors challenging? And how can we support our survivors and protect them from becoming a missing or murdered relative? And feel free to also touch in areas of how those challenges were increased due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can start with Pat.
Like I said earlier, what challenges for clients to come in is fear of retaliation, fear of all of those things. The basic things that we take for advantage, whether it be transportation, gas, childcare, all of those things is a big barrier to clients. I think how we can support our survivors and protect them from becoming another statistic is listening to them. I think a lot of times they tell us things indirectly or even directly, is listening to their voices because they're trying to talk, they share things. I feel like a lot of times clients, they kind of sometimes beat around the bush. And I can say that because I was a victim myself. And there's ways that you want to share things without telling the whole story, and that could be for personal reasons, whether you trust somebody or not. But I think from the advocate scope, working with clients and also being a survivor is, you know, making sure that the organizations that each of these clients are going to are trained very well, making sure that, you know, there's empathy first of all, first and foremost. You know, we're making sure that staff members want to work in that field and that they're not just working there for a paycheck. You know, that's the last thing, honestly. I feel like you should be working in a domestic violence field, um, and it should be your number one passion. You know, I think that's one thing that we all have in common here is this is our passion. You know, we want to find a solution, and though it may, you know, may never be 100% solved, every day we work to stop that for our people, for our relatives, and for our children. I think for our future, that's our main goal. And just, you know, I think this will always be mentioned, but looking at our laws and our legislation, our law enforcement, and how can we make that better? You know, Miski talked earlier about dispatch. You know, I was reading an article about, I think Phoenix has like where you can text 911. We don't even have a 911 in Windorak. You have to call like a number, a full number. But people that, you know, aren't familiar with the area, they don't know that. So if they're trying to dial 911, where is it going to go? They're, you know, who knows what might happen to them. So that's just one of the things that I think there's a lot of things that lack, and I don't want to take anybody's spotlight away. So I'll let you guys go next.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was already mentioned in the first round of answers, you know, the funding issues, the structural issues, the like everyday lack of just community infrastructure and services and access to services that create all these boundaries. But I think one of the things that is really endemic in our communities in particular is, and maybe even in society at large, is like even when addressing these issues, the onus is often put on the victims to be the ones to change their situation. And you know, and that's why I feel like victims feel a lot of these barriers and are very self-conscious about taking on the full weight of that responsibility, because you're asking them to go against like all of these structural and historical issues, not just their abuser, you know, like, and that's not fair. Debbie put into the chat, hey Debbie, wish I could see you, it's been a long time, but she made a very good point in the chat about how I've seen this too. Our mothers tend to put a lot of the responsibility on girls and on femme identifying relatives to be responsible for their own safety, to make like choices for healthy relationships when that's not how domestic violence starts, right? Domestic violence can definitely start in a relationship rooted in love. And I think that that's one of those myths that needs to be broken as well. Like women aren't tricked, are not unaware, are missing intelligence when they get into these situations. None of our relatives who are getting into these violent situations are missing any of that. No one should be blamed for having the courage to love and trust another human being. But you know, when we're pitting that type of pressure onto people to be those advocates for themselves, and not pitting that same pressure on these abusers, not naming them, not holding them accountable, we don't have to be a victim advocate to do that. We all know who those people are. We all shared how endemic this is in our communities. And so we know who these relatives are, and it's our responsibility through our kinship, through our clan values, through our clan responsibilities, through who we are as Diné people, as people that are part of the society, to hold those individuals accountable and make sure they don't hurt another person. We can't keep waiting for these larger structural issues to change or for the funding to suddenly appear. I am so upset that our tribal government allowed the funding for our domestic violence shelters to lapse in the midst of a pandemic and a crisis where we already had enough information to know that this was going to lead to a rise in domestic violence and sexual violence and violence against children. There is no excuse for that. But we also can't wait around for bureaucrats and politicians to make up and fix these systemic issues. We also have to step up to the plate to create these safe spaces and to pit resources together in order to help victims where they're at and help hold accountable their abusers sisters, and also name them and keep them accountable and keep them visible. If jail's not going to work, if prison's not going to work, if the police aren't going to show up, we show up for our own sisters and our own relatives.
Excellent, excellent point. I do have a comment I want to read. This is from Debbie Nez Manuel. In my experiences, too often mothers in my life have held girls accountable in a much different way, and over time created society of males who know they will not be held accountable. This creates risk factors for many women, girls, or LGBTQ. If left unchanged, creates chronic types of abuse for violence in the home or among family members, vice versa. Women find themselves fighting back, not accepting any more violence. Thank you for sharing that, Debbie.
I'd like to sort of respond. Janine, thank you. That critique is absolutely necessary, and a clear call to action for what we need to do. One of the things that when challenges that prevent survivors to get services, and we've all had these examples as advocates. I was on a call yesterday with someone who trusted me enough to tell me what happened to them, but was afraid to do anything about it because they believed that no one would believe them, because the first time they told the authorities did nothing. And so when we talk about what are some of the challenges, some of the primary challenges are first empowering that survivor, letting them know that they are loved, letting them know that it's not their fault, letting them know that it's okay to feel the pain, letting them know it's okay to feel angry. I think for many, that's the thing that's often missing when we think about these services, is oftentimes we talk about trauma-informed, we talk about all of these critiques, but in that moment, we forget there's a real person who is afraid to even just talk about what happened to them. And we can talk about all of the structures about why, but in that moment, what they need to hear from us is, you matter. And I think that's oftentimes that's what's missing from a lot of the work when we talk about work that is supposed to help heal and push us to being healed. We oftentimes don't think about really using the healing words that are necessary for these victims. And certainly we get frustrated because this person just didn't want to do anything. And certainly, most certainly they went back to that situation. But at least they left me knowing that they mattered. And I think for a lot of these, it's that fear of just being able to just lift their voice, because they don't know, oftentimes because of the trauma they went through, they don't know that they matter, that they're loved. And I think that's the first step when we talk about how do we address these structural things. The first radical step is to say, yes, you matter. Awe shiyaje hako. I mean, those are the healing words. And I think those are the necessary thing. That's where we begin to start. And that's the thing that, at least the work that I'm trying to do, is really base it in that.
Yes, definitely. It reminds me of something that one of my mentors, Dr. Larry Emerson, he was very vital in helping me heal and recognize that, I am a survivor and it's okay to talk about these things, that I'm worthy. A lot of the things that Moroni is talking about, but I think that we as Diné people, we need to go back to our original selves and remember that. And that's something that I always think about when I'm in my work, and because there's that fierceness, and with that fierceness came warrior societies, where if you did anything wrong, you were ousted, you were held accountable in our circles. And we're also forgetting that compassion in our geh, that ajobat, that jobat, that clan camaraderie that teaches us that everybody is worthy. Instead, we see so much lateral oppression in our communities, jealousy, greed, and these colonial systems that are set up. We can't continue to follow them because they're not made for us to prosper. They're made for us to continue to be oppressive to each other. You know, we really need to go back to building nations and communities where violence within our interpersonal relationships is unimaginable. Like that we just want to have that fierce love for one another and that we're all worthy. That's the kind of F that we need to go back to and that we're forgetting.
Thank you, Ahiaha. I just wanted to chime in, Jolene, and I appreciate the conversation. We did get a comment in terms of how do we keep Native men accountable. And I think in this time and age, it's not, and I'm trying not to just look at things as a constructed gender, but you know, people's experiences and places in power, and how I know that there's been some discussions, right, like the Sunny Boy syndrome or the Yaj wars. And I think in terms of what we do and when we try to voice out, when we say, like, let's empower the community and let's call to action, in my own experience, there will be this whole wave of individuals who will try to squash that movement, who will try to gaslight and use all of those tools of violence to stymie what we're trying to do in a collective effort. And I really feel like that should be addressed as we talk about this, because then those tools are used to I love how Moroni didn't say like we're preyed on, that we're targeted. And we've seen that when individuals target whether it's women, men, however they identify, but they have a trauma, an unhealed trauma. And so they start finding attachment. And then they think it's their first love, but it's not an attachment. It's your trauma response in trying to feel secure and not, you know, the abandonment that you went through. So it is a lot of work, like the inner child, to love yourself, to say, I do love myself, and getting us to that point. And sometimes that feels too touchy-feely, but it really is a strength within so that we can project and help each other. I'm writing down all of the issues regarding, you know, the cell towers. We need a 911, we need shelters, our laws are too lenient. And so if I can make my own call to action, I'm one of 24 delegates. And I can cast a vote, and I can only vote for myself and in my district. And so the call to action too is, how do we transform Navajo leadership to first recognize that this is a systemic issue on Navajo? And then second, to be brave enough and to say, we're going to fully fund these programs of healing. We're going to fund the prevention. We're going to fund the cultural and language program, because we know every $1 we invest in prevention is $7 that we save, like to incarcerate someone. We're building these huge judicial centers that really kind of pull resources away that I think we should be doing in prevention work, and so that individuals have a value and see a value in themselves. And not only then, we have to think of the system not valuing that individual is missing or that individual has been taken, because I'm very concerned with Operation Lady Justice, the federal task force that had said, you know, being missing is not a crime. And I was like, excuse me, if a child is missing, that is a crime. If someone is in a domestic violence or in a violent situation and the family is concerned, that should give us enough, not just evidence, but just humanity, you know, in a humanistic approach to go out and try to track that individual down and use law enforcement tools, whether it's accessing or looking at how they've been on their social media, accessing their telephone, working with the courts. It's these small things that we can pull together so that the families at least know, okay, my relative, my emotional response to this matters, and that it's not being blown out of proportion. And then going back to that and keeping the system accountable for that individual who was considered missing. I'm looking at data from Navajo Nation Public Safety. If we don't know on the call, we did lose our statistician this summer. She was we lost her to COVID. And so it's been a real challenge to get this year's data and how it fluctuates. But last year's data across Navajo Nation, with their data, they've only identified one person who's been reported missing that foul play was indicated. One person across Navajo Nation. And so we have to look back and say, okay, how do they determine if foul play was indicated? How do they determine if this person needs help? And then how are they supporting the family? And so I think it goes back to that, because if you have a victim of domestic violence who finds the strength to go to advocate to seek help, we also have to see how a family of a missing individual needs that same support structure. Because we have seen a delay in reporting, especially when it comes to Navajo men. Maybe it's 3 months down the line, they'll say, usually they come back home. But my Yaj, I remember in Tuba City, she said, every day I'm looking down the road and I'm expecting my Yaj to come back, and he has not come back. And some people say, well, why did you wait that long? Well, if there's a system that doesn't value his life or value his mom's experience in thinking her son is gone, we're going to continue to have these issues of delay reporting if they report at all. On this call and on this panel, I think it's important to note that, you know, some of this more in my capacity as a delegate and hearing from my community, first it was just whispers, and then people saying, please go on the radio and ask the people if they've seen my daughter. This is her description. Do you have a poster, Shema? Do you have a police report? No, but she's been missing. And so I think it's also like cutting down those barriers. And I think it's really critical then like how we do this victim blaming. And so I just wanted to touch base on that if we can rally the support to have leadership to make a commitment, not a promise, because we know those promises can be broken, but a straight commitment, and maybe where the group to start, like either a petition, either an initiative, something to say, we have funding that's available and it has to go to the people. And maybe it's the people then to say, we want to value these healing centers, these shelters, these places for rehabilitation. Because if we're saying all lives matter, then we have to rehabilitate that perpetrator. We have to, for whatever they suffer through their life. So I wanted to throw that because as a delegate, I need help. I need help when it comes to the council floor. I need help when dealing with a vice president and continuing to educate the office of the first lady, second lady, because they're interacting at a federal level with our Washington partners, but they're still making comments that, Navajo people just want to be missing. I don't understand that statement. And I'll continue to push back and say, if someone wants to be missing, then they could contact the police and be like, I'm okay, here's my wellness check and take me off the list. But until that person calls and you could verify it's that person's missing, and we should be figuring out how we could use modern technology to help find them. So I just think about the families and hearing them in the forums. And so no one can erase their stories, hearing from the moms, hearing from the dads who are looking for their children. And as a mother, your child is always your child. And so I just feel at times that I'm not doing enough, and this kind of imposter syndrome that I shouldn't be the one saying this, but I truly believe the Holy Ones are creating this opportunity for us to empower each other and to create the change for our children, for our grandchildren, for their grandchildren. If we didn't create this violence, then we can definitely start creating that healing pathway for them. Thank you.
I just want to do a really quick time check with everyone. It is about 7:14, and it looks like we're getting questions. So I'm going to ask one more question from our official list, and then we can go ahead and jump into these questions here in the timeline that folks are asking. So thank you all for that discussion. So the next question is, and it's a pretty big one. Oh, I'm sorry, not that question. How can the plight of the LGBTQ2S folks be included in the MMDR and domestic violence work, and what needs to be improved at the Navajo Nation level? And if you also want to include what also can be done at the MMIWGT2S level, which is the national level, and that stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Trans, and Two-Spirit.
I guess I should start off. So we have been restoring ancestral winds. We've been doing a lot of work with Two-Spirit LGBTQ issues around intimate partner violence, and also looking at how Two-Spirits have been impacted or even perceived and in this entire crisis of the MMDR crisis. And one of the things that we're finding, and it's the same thing and just in terms of framing, is that when we think about Two-Spirit or LGBTQ, there already is a specific type of framing, and according to like these larger racial orders, right? There's somewhat of a racial hierarchy, and then there's women of color, Native women who are just kind of and the point I'm making about this is that in terms of that, that's also the level of legibility or how someone perceives someone as a person, how they read someone as a person. And it's based a lot on the color. And so when we think about this question of LGBTQ, it's often that they're read as non-human. They're read as disposable, as oftentimes Native women are as well. Most oftentimes Native women are read as easily disposable. As non-human, as subhuman, if you will. And so when we think about the LGBTQ, that's also what is going on, because that also is a very specific type of targeting, whether it's a targeting for specific type of physical violence or sexual violence or whatever else is in between all of that type of violence. And oftentimes what happens, what we find across the country with our Two-Spirit brothers and sisters, is they oftentimes end up experiencing more violence over their own lifetime than anyone else. So for example, the Navajo Nation, Diné College did a study in 2017, 2016, that showed that just within a 6-month period, 20% of LGBTQ Navajos had experienced physical violence, verbal physical assault. And I think it was about 70% of them had experienced some form of violence towards them within a 6-month period. And so when we talk about what's happening in the Navajo Nation, there's a lot going on in the Navajo Nation. And one of the paradoxes that I find is that in the Navajo Nation, I find there are more Two-Spirit LGBTQ that are in positions of decision-making, but yet nothing happens in terms of like how to mitigate this type of violence. And so oftentimes I think that there is an emerging class in the Navajo Nation where oftentimes there's just a difference in the way LGBTQ have their own experience. And I can speak that for myself, I am a cis Two-Spirit man. That's what most of the LGBTQ community calls me straight adjacent, meaning I'm straight looking, straight passing. And so I can get around that, but once individuals will find out, I'll get nasty things sent to me, I'll get targeted messages about specific things. And so those are the things that we're talking about in terms of how do we incorporate that. We have to then start thinking about how really the biggest thing is getting access and finding this community, because as we all know, they're one of the hard to reach populations, as we call them. Very difficult to, just because we're so dispersed, some are still in the closet. I mean, there's just a whole, and domestic violence can be termed as outing someone as well. I mean, that's one of the things and when one gets outed, oftentimes they become a target of violence, and oftentimes that doesn't end very well. And so there's just all sorts of things going on around this. And so Restoring Ancestral Winds, we're working on creating a specific research agenda to figure out exactly what is happening to our two brothers and sisters, and really what because they are also represented disproportionately as well in the data that we're seeing for the missing and murdered across the country. And so we would like to know precisely what's happening more with this specific group.
Yeah, I didn't want to speak first because I know Dr. Benali would school us on a lot of things that we need to be schooled on. And I just want to follow up by stressing the importance of needing to name the role of organized and politicized religion and the way that we marginalize and make invisible not only the existence of all of our relatives who live along the spectrum of gender identities and sexual orientation, but also their value to our communities and to our society. And so I feel like this is also the same thing that women have experienced throughout time, right? We're always talking about women's rights and like all the advancements that have been made. And like it took generations for women to get the right to vote and to achieve reproductive health and to like have ability and a say in some manner over our bodies. And that's got taken away in almost one administration. And it's because it doesn't matter if we're in positions of leadership or if we're given some little bit of decision-making power, when we're still operating under these structures of heteropatriarchy that is rooted in Christian values that don't value females, that doesn't value women, that doesn't value Mother Earth, and that's being spread throughout our communities, that's the source of the disruption of our community social nets that we need to protect our relatives and to hold abusers to account and stop these cycles of violence from perpetuating throughout our communities and being taught to our children. And I can't stress this enough. It doesn't mean that everyone that's a part of an organized religion ascribes to this. I don't think that that's true. But as structures, as institutions, and in the way that these values and these teachings are politicized, especially when it's embodied in the highest office of this nation, it has a real impact over whose voices are heard and whose lives have value. And this is why we have seen so much erasure and so many challenges when it comes to people trying to create access and pathways to justice. And this is also why our justice system is only predicated on being punitive. It's only about punishing the bad guy. Whereas in our culture, we talk about restorative justice, we talk about healing, we talk about returning to balance. And if we were to truly understand that and incorporate that into our systems of governance and our systems of our legal systems, then we would be asking every single victim, no matter what they represent or what background they come from, what is your form of restorative justice? What do you need to heal your spirit, to return your spirit back to yourself so that you can continue on your pathway and manifest your destiny to be a five-fingered sacred holy being, carrying out sacred responsibilities to your community, to your loved one, and to your future generations, your descendants. But we don't ask that. And we need to start. And until our religion and our cultural teachings stop being demonized, we're never going to be able to fully manifest that reality.
I think another huge component when we're critically looking at our nation, specifically Diné Nation, is that, there's a lot of homophobia, transphobia, sexism, and they're deeply embedded in Diné patriarchy. And cowboy culture is a huge thing that they too have just intertwined, like Janine has mentioned, or the churches, all of these ways, all of these filters of how they have become a part of our societies. And we need to really look at them, because look at who we're learning it from. We're learning these from these behaviors from settlers from the South, from the Midwest. And, it's interesting to see during this election year what types of conversations are happening in our communities. And a lot of them are stemmed in racism. They're stemmed in homophobia, transphobia, but nobody is talking about those things. And until we talk about them, we're never going to fully be inclusive the way that we need to be, the way that we need to show up for our relatives. And it goes back to that same idea of going back to our original selves. Because as Diné people, if we go back to our original selves, we'll understand and know that LGBTQ2S relatives are sacred. they're gods, they're goddesses. There's duality that has been deeply embedded in our songs, in our prayers, and our ceremonies. We have to remind ourselves that, whatever these phobias are, or this sexism is, it's all learned behavior. And we have to critically think about how we're not going to continue to teach these ideologies to the 12 generations ahead.
One more thing, Jolene, thank you, Kim. And just talking about like sort of the practical impact of what both Janine and Kim said. So for a couple of years ago, I did some work with some partners here in Salt Lake, tracking LGBTQ homeless Native Indigenous people in Salt Lake City. And what we found, a lot of the youth that we found at these spot count and moment checks is what they're called, young Navajo kids, some as young as 13 years old, who identify as gay, kicked out of their homes and from the Navajo Nation. They end up on the streets, they end up as sex workers. Oftentimes, some of them may have been a victim of domestic violence themselves, and they're running away from that, and they're a victim of it because they're gay in their family, or they're lesbian, or they're trans, or two-spirit. And oftentimes they end up running away, and they end up on these streets, they end up going missing, they end up being targets of violence, and they end up being murdered. And so when we talk about all of these things about heteropatriarchy and all of this, for most people, it's just these big words, but it has a real impact. Like the patriarchy in the Navajo Nation has a real violent consequence in terms of ending up with our relatives who end up missing. Young kids as young as 13 end up being on the street as a sex worker. And so that's what we talk about. And that's what we when we talk about the LGBTQ and what's missing, that's the element that we really need to be thinking about. Is like, what can we do to prevent things like that? Outside of these larger structures, what can we do in a community to tell grandma and grandpa to hug their children and say, it's okay. And so those are the things that we're trying to look at, is how do we get those types of things in place? What sort of programs and community activities do we need for that? Yeah.
Jolene, I wanted to add, in our experience and advocating for and helping families distribute flyers. Recently, there was a discussion where the family, I don't know if they just had a challenge or it was extended family, where they were misgendering the individual who was missing, and they weren't providing a photo of the individual who, obviously wore makeup every day and identified, I don't want to speak for this individual, but possibly like a trans woman. And so it was difficult then to post pictures of really someone who just exist in their memory and not the actual person. So I think that's where we have to talk about is when an individual identifies as trans, or if the life, we also then have to educate the family who's going through it. And I need education. I need to know then what would be the proper pronouns and the proper words. So I just say shall we. Everybody's our baby. Everybody belongs to us, and it doesn't genderize anything. But I also think in terms of trying to get that individual back home safely, if we could maybe figure out a way to support families because they may be embarrassed, or the reason why they didn't release pictures of the individual in their true form is so that they don't get that resentment. And so I think that's something we'll still need to further dialogue in this community work. And I'm here listening and learning. And I just appreciate my daughter and this next generation who are all about like just pan love and stop asking mom, and I'll love who I want to love. And I just think they're so brave, right? Some of our youngsters are so fierce, but also realizing that there's actually that's not the norm here on Navajo, and where they still feel that they need to not share who they are and who they love and share that freely. I always think if it's two consenting individuals, really it's none of my business what happens. And so I think that's something we should bring into this movement and in our education. So thank you.
I just want to make one thing known and clear as well, is that not only is there toxic patriarchy, there's also toxic matriarchy. You know, it's not, you know, it stems from both parents or both genders or whatever, you know, and it is deeply embedded in our culture as Diné people, and we need to unlearn it as soon as possible. And as Amber's mentioning, this younger generation that's coming in, they're teaching us and they're showing the way. They're showing up fiercely, and we need to step back and let them, you know, lead.
Yes, that is exactly what I was thinking, Shetta Kim. We have recruited a couple of new members in our team, and I guess they're referred to as Zoomers, and they have taken a lot of these initiatives by the helm and have been also educating me in several of these different areas. So I really do appreciate that we're also inclusive of our young folks who are passionate when it comes to this work. And Shetta Amber Crotty gave me some really good advice one time. They said that you're not a real leader until you've mentored or brought forth another young person right after you. So those words always resonate with me, and I'm really happy that we're having a lot more young folks involved with our MMDR. I do want to do a time check. It's 6:30. I'm not quite sure if you want to take one more question. Just want to feel it out before y'all okay with one. And this is a big question, and this is the one that I think each of the questions where you've all answered definitely has a lot to do with community, but as well as like building trust. And just before I get to that, I did get a question from Asia Wilson. How can people groups outside of the Navajo Nation support the cause and the people? I feel like you could just support through whether that's social media or reaching out to community organizations and asking how you can support. There's so many different ways and avenues how you can support a lot of the work that we're doing. And I'm gonna put up our contact information there, and we could have like a more fleshed out conversation, Asia. So thank you so much for that question. So this last question was actually developed with one of our missing and murdered Indigenous persons coordinator for the state of Arizona. And I think it's a really good question. So what are your thoughts on overcoming the distrust of law enforcement? And how do you feel we can relationship build to develop a healthy dialogue where communities can feel safe? And just to give you a little bit of context, why we asked this question is when we had this discussion during one of our task force meetings, the question was posed to us like, why don't community members want to work with law enforcement? I get so far in a case that I'm almost there, but then the family, you know, or whomever I'm working with steps back. And so the question was asked of our group was like, how do you get them to work with us? And in a very anti way, we had to remind this individual who's, you know, very good at doing the work that they're doing as well, that that responsibility is not placed on us. It's not placed on the community. So we developed this question with that in mind is, what does like a healthy Navajo Nation community look like? And how do we relationship build with these structures, with these agencies that certainly have been a part of inflicting a lot of that trauma in our communities? And it's a really big question. So, and we can end it there after this one. So I wanna start with, I want to say Mesky, because Mesky probably, as far as I know, is one of the individuals who has a lot of experience working with law enforcement as well as the families. And I feel like there's a lot of great insight there.
Yeah, so the number one thing that we've noticed is that there is lack of communication between law enforcement and families when it comes to cases. And we do understand that there's only a certain amount of information that they can give to families, but also keeping in contact with families. Although there may not be an update on their loved one's case, but saying, hi, I just wanted to give you a phone call and let you know that we're still looking into the case. It's open, but we haven't had any results yet. But as soon as we do, I will give you a call. But that right there is not being done. So a lot of the family members feel as though they're being ignored. And a lot of the distrust in this comes from that lack of communication. And it's really sad to see, because our very first meeting that we had with Vice President at the time, Jonathan Nez, we brought in a criminal investigator. Public safety had invited a criminal investigator, and right off the bat, she was very, very, she wasn't a nice person. Let me just put it that way. She was aggressive towards her questions and her answers. So right there, that showed me that a lot of the families are afraid to ask for help. They're afraid to ask for updates. They're afraid to call, because they're going to start feeling that they are a burden. And that is not what they should feel. And I know there's several of our family members that do feel like that presently right now. And they should never feel that way. Law enforcement does need to, I know I say training with, empathy and customer service. And I believe that's been brought up several times, but the situation is still the same. And right now, I think that one thing that we can do, since we are hosting these virtual forums, and because we want to also practice our COVID-19 precautions and safety, is that we can invite law enforcement. Why don't we try to invite Chief Francisco to answer some of these questions, not from us, but directly from the community? What is it that they can do? I know that they had these sessions where they invited the community to come out and ask questions, and that went good. But the thing is that a lot of the times the event information wasn't put out in time. So a lot of people didn't show up. I went to several of them, and there wasn't too many of the community members that were aware of these sessions. So maybe we can invite law enforcement to come on and answer directly from the community. That would also bring some kind of trust, not trust, but a form of communication that would start on a path for trust. And right there, that's something that we all need to build on. And we do need to work with law enforcement, and also law enforcement needs to work with us, and especially the families.
I saw that you wanted Pat to answer. Is Pat gonna provide an answer? Because I have something to add too.
I can say something real quick. I just wanted to add on to what Ms. Key said about having that open dialogue, and having law enforcement, a part of conversations. And I think reaching out to them, I think a lot of us do that already. But for example, with Strengthening Nations, the organization that I co-founded, that was one of my main goals, because I've seen that in domestic violence, the fear of law enforcement, because we have had victims where their partners were officers or law enforcement. And so that was, of course, that's going to be a barrier. They're not going to want to call the cops or anything. There's going to be a lot of things preventing them from filing that report. So one of my main goals and priority, and I'm glad, that we accomplished it, was having law enforcement on our board, to have them a part, to listen to them, to make sure that they're part of all these DV events. And not only just law enforcement, but as a Native woman lieutenant be on our board. So I think, trying to look for, creative ways to have them, they don't have to be necessarily involved in that capacity, but including them in as many conversations as possible as that they can be in, because there are some people in law enforcement that are passionate about this as much as we are. It's just finding them. They're out there. It's kind of like finding the needle in the haystack thing, but it's not impossible. So I think that's one of the things that I wanted to touch on that real quick. So
yeah, also I would just like to add, maybe if they were brought into the conversation and explain to families what they are allowed to talk about so that they have a better understanding of how they have to operate so that they don't feel like they're being ignored.
I think throughout the whole night we were talking about and bringing together all of the different linkages between different structural and systemic issues. And I've seen even in the chat, people asking about the linkages are practices that are very harmful in our legal system to actually devalue or criticize and flip, a victim's story in order to prove their case. And this is all part of the system and part of the game, right? So when we're talking about involvement of law enforcement, that always makes me cringe a little bit because my first experience when working with battered family services as a really young girl, when my mother was a victim advocate there, was how many of her clients were in relationships with police officers. And this isn't just in Gallup, like this is endemic across the board. 40% of police officers that have been reported for domestic violence is like a hard statistic. It's hard numbers. And that's just people who've been reported or who've been caught. When we know there's a whole system there, both the internal brotherhood, but also the legal system that creates so many barriers and challenges for women to actually name their perpetrators and bring them to justice, especially when they work within the justice system. Like I think when we're talking about police informant, we're talking about that's way at the bottom, right? Like that's when the situation has gotten so dire, someone is already gone, a relative is already missing, or they've already been beaten so badly that they're now at that point where they're desperate enough to actually report and bring someone to justice if the system even works for them. When I reported what happened to me, I was strong and I was forced by the FBI because it was a criminal case and because my perpetrator was off the reservation. I was forced to testify in detail about all of the times that I could remember being raped as a child and all of the things that were done to me over and over and over again, only to be told, and that was I didn't know then that was a test for me. That was them employing these tactics to see how good my memory was, to see how many details I could stitch together consistently enough. And at the end of the day, they told me they couldn't prosecute anyway because their caseload was so much and we only had 2 FBI agents assigned to the reservation at that time to handle any cases. So they gave me a voucher for counseling services. I needed counseling services to even just unravel that experience, let alone my whole history of trauma. When that's what our women are being put through, it's not about trying to figure out how to fix the law enforcement, because there's a whole lot of stuff that needs to be. I'm all about defunding the police and redirecting those funding to preventative measures that start with incorporating into our school system and early education, sex education and education on healthy relationships, education on coping mechanisms and how to be an advocate for yourself, how to recognize abuse, how to name it. We know the power of getting the tools to being able to name your experience as it's the first step to being able to re-empower yourself and take your power back and stop this situation. We also need more money for advocacy groups and support groups. Our women should not be left to just rely on law enforcement to help them. We need to start bringing in to the conversation hospitals. There used to be standards here. And when my mom used to work at Battered Family Services, she required all of the hospitals and health clinics to post up information for women and victims of domestic violence on how to contact and get resources. She instituted practices where people were once they saw and had seen signs of this or learned how to recognize signs, they created a confidentiality space where this person was taken alone and given the resources and the comfort that they needed in order to really talk about what was going on at home, what brought them into that place in the first place. They don't do that anymore. And this is where we have to stay on top of all of these institutions so that this education and this advocacy is normalized. And it's not just pit on special interests or on one pathway in terms of a solution. This is an endemic problem that requires a systemic approach in order to create the social nets, the social responses, the emergency services, and all of the other support that is needed to heal our communities and help us finally break these cycles of violence and these cycles of trauma so that we do not continue to have this inherited by future generations.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Janine. We have to look at the police state, and the police state is the primary perpetuator of gendered violence, and so they can't be the solution to the violence. The state is not our ally, and we have to really assert our sovereignty and believe in ourselves, believe that we are able and capable of creating these systems that are best suited for our people. Because otherwise, the current police state is racist. It doesn't value Black lives. It doesn't value Indigenous lives. It doesn't value LGBTQ relatives as well. Gender violence and missing and murdered Indigenous relatives are symptoms of colonialism, of white supremacy and genocide. They are symptoms of the disposition of Diné people in our homeland. It's how these industries, they also protect the industries to come into our communities that bring the drugs, that bring the fracturing, all of the violence. And our warriors, if that's what they want to call themselves, really need to critically look at what is happening and listen to survivors, listen to the community, because they're the ones who will help guide you. We're the ones who know. We live in our communities day in, day out, and we could be a great resource so that we can come together as a community and really figure out what is necessary for the healing and the protection of our people.
Thank you both, Kim and Janine, really powerful. I'll just be the really boring policy wonk that says, okay. So now we have, like, for example, this is great. I think we ought to be moving towards what both Kim and Janine are talking about, but tomorrow, for example, victim advocates have to deal with someone. There's a perpetrator out there right now, and this is the current system we have right now, because we haven't been able to successfully build the communities at this moment. And so for me, when I read the question, it's like, at this moment, so for tomorrow, how do we deal with this racist, this structure that has been historically violent towards our communities? But then I also think about, like, Navajo tribal police. I would rather be followed by Navajo tribal police than a Salt Lake City police officer, honestly. And so when we think about the distrust, and I think the question from the MMIP coordinator is coming from a non-native, non-Navajo perspective of, like, oh, how do we get them to trust us? And I'm like, you probably don't. The most they're going to do is tell you they're going to trust the system will deliver them some sort of justice. They won't trust you. And I think that's the thing. And even that, asking them to trust the system is a big ask, because oftentimes a lot of these victims of domestic violence will end up talking, but they won't be believed, or there will be insufficient insufficient information to move forward, or it's been too long, or they're just coming off as distrustful. And in those moments, those are those moments, like, tomorrow, what do we do in that moment? And so for me, how then do we work in a coordinated fashion with law enforcement in order to bring healing? Because we know that they're not going to bring healing. What we do know is that they operate in order to punish. They act as a deterrent. That's what law enforcement is a deterrent from someone doing bad. And what we're looking at is a violation of duties rather than a violation of rights. And the police aren't interested in violation of duties, they're interested in violations of rights. And when we talk about Kehwingsen and this entire Keh system, it's a domestic violence in any of its form, whether it's verbal or physical, psychological, emotional. Those are transgressions and violations of basic Diné principles of being and duty. And so when we think about police, are they being taught that that's how we interact? Or is it entirely based on just a system of a violation of rights? And I think that's where we have the fundamental law, because that was it anticipated that there were going to be these problems. And I think the Navajo Nation could really start taking a look at the fundamental law and say, how can we use this to restructure a peacekeeping system, a security system, or whatever we want to call it, instead of law enforcement, that can actually help mitigate this type of violence that will bring healing. But in the meantime, we have to find a way to work with what we have right now. And I think for me, what I tell people is we just have to do our best to trust the system, not necessarily the investigator. And that's a big ask.
So I appreciate the conversation. I think this is a part where looking at the data, looking at what's happening, and having to develop these policy solutions, right? For funding, for grants, for programming, what can help provide some of these solutions. And I will always go back to say that the community has the knowledge if they are empowered to be part of the solution. So as we talk about these systems and structures, we've also pushed aside that knowledge and pushed aside the role of some of like our matriarchs or some of our community leaders to participate in the healing process, but also looking at how they could be the first line of not so much like law enforcement, but a response when there's someone missing. So it's like activating the family, training the community, working with the schools, working with the clinics who are invested in the community, but really at this point don't have the tools on what it will take when someone is called in as missing. If you have a missing child, if you have someone in the community who has not come back and should be back, so that we're not just wanting to make that 911 call or the expectations that we put on our law enforcement. And so I think I have to look at, I know that our law enforcement is probably half of the force that it was about 20 years ago. So what pressure do I have as Navajo leadership and our Navajo to advocate and say, you are chronically defunding our systems here on Navajo. And matter of fact, if you don't know, we've actually had to sue the BIA to fully fund our not only our criminal justice system, but our courts who have the peacemaking, who have the restorative justice. And so every year we've been chronically underfunded, where now finally we won the case and we're going to receive $15 million. But what does that mean when you're chronically underfunded? So $15 million for like the last 15 years. And so what system are you creating? And so I have to go back and forth on how I can support not only the community, but what support does law enforcement need to understand if they feel, and looking at their data, well, we only have a handful of missing individuals that are reported. So that's an issue in terms of trust. But then what do you do when there's a missing individual? And so it's having that training with the dispatch, like the whole system, the dispatcher to the law enforcement who comes onto the scene, if it gets reported to the criminal investigators, and making sure they have that communication. And then when when we talk about trust, I know that there are good individuals, but the experience that I had, especially at the U.S. Senate hearing, was we had FBI criminal investigator, the director of the program, testify before tribal leadership, and he blatantly told the community back in 2018, missing and murdered individuals is not an issue in Indian country. And so the senators asked him, do you have the resources that you need in Indian country? Yes, I have the resources that I need in Indian country. And I thought to myself, sitting right in back of him, what does this individual need to know? Or what do we need to shout so that he could recognize that there's a situation here. There's a situation in Indian country. There's a situation going on Navajo Nation. And so we have to bridge those conversations on not just building trust when you have an individual family member who's missing from the community, but then looking at it like at the tribal level and then the federal level and how these all intersect, because we have a missing woman, Navajo woman, who was taken outside of our boundaries, but that individual who is a prime suspect, and in my opinion, hurt her, and now we can't, and he went through so many jurisdictions that the family having to deal with who do you report to, where do they reside? Well, they were last seen here in the border town, but they really live on the nation. So you need to go to Navajo Nation Police, and the Navajo Nation Police saying, no, you need to go back to that city or that border town where they were last seen, because that's where the possible crime occurred, if it's a crime. And so it's that constant not taking responsibility. So if I could offer a solution, we need to put together training for search teams, follow-ups on investigations, and I think it's at a point where Navajo Nation should invest in private investigators. I know that we talk about cold cases and looking at some of the challenges, but we also need investigators who are willing to look for that needle in the haystack. So if we're saying our lives matter, then we need to put our funding towards that, and we need to develop these sophisticated ways so that you have this wraparound service, so that we could provide healing, so that we could provide prevention. Because what we see when we talk to our families who have told their stories over and over and waiting for some type of relief, now we're seeing those children, and that's sometimes the hardest part of this work, is then their children, their parent who is missing, then starts having those suicidal ideations. They then maybe run away or become missing themselves. And so it's just this cycle that we need to address. And so it's looking at the data, it's looking at the stories. And as we build up this trust with law enforcement, advocates can serve and provide that guidance. And we are trying to build that up on Navajo Nation. We're way behind in terms of what we need to do. But I want to thank everybody on the call who's from Navajo Nation Strengthening Families. We've been doing this work together and trying to hold the program together, and other advocates who are on the line. Because if their funding is not stable, then we have destabilized the trust also, because then they're not able to adequately communicate with the families. So thank you very much for the question. And I don't want to place blame or shame. I just want to say this is what it is. And if anybody on the line who has a comment or a suggestion or a follow-up, or how you want to be on part of this discussion, we have a weekly Missing and Murdered Diné Relatives call. So join the conversation, join the work that we're doing to provide justice to our families and healing. So yeah.
Great.
I have something to add too. And it goes down to stories that have been passed down about our clanships and how, we were essentially warrior societies. Each clan took care of different elements in our Diné society. And we really need to go back to that and find our warrior spirit, channel the Ganado Mucho or Manuelito, because everything was centered around ceremony. Ceremony was at the core. And then from there, it trickled down to be inclusive to the community. And, we are self-sufficient people. We are self-determining people. And we really have to remember that strong, resilient communities are born out of individuals being their best selves. And we have to show up that way for each other. And we have to really have more conversations like this. We have to break down these barriers and have these conversations based off of care, so that we can continue to be resilient, to be self-determinating. And, we have it in us. We just have to really go back and remember our original selves.
Yeah, thank you so much to our panelists. I think we can go ahead and close it right here.
One more thing, Ginny, sorry, Jolene, before you end, the Utah missing and murdered women and girls task force will be having their first meeting, and it'll be a virtual meeting on October 21st, starting at 5, and we will welcome as many comments as possible from any and all who would like to participate. We'll have the information out in the next week or so. So we really would appreciate your participation in that.
Great, thank you so much for mentioning that, Moroni. I believe the New Mexico Indian Affairs Department, they also have a MMIW task force. They will be meeting soon, and we'll go ahead and reshare that content on our social media. As well as Arizona. Arizona does have a study committee, but I believe they are wrapping up their report. And as soon as we get that information, we'll definitely share it on our socials. Just wanted to thank our panelists for this very powerful conversation that we had. The objective wasn't to have all the answers tonight, but it was to really create conversation and supplement our thought processes when we start to think about these issues within our community. What does that look like for us? And what do we envision when we think about a healthy Navajo Nation? And also just like centering our survivors and the families who are going through these different traumatic processes. And the great thing about our MMDR task force is that we're taking a multidisciplinary approach to this. It's not just law enforcement, you know, it's also community work. It's also our researchers, it's our college students, it's our on the ground advocates like Mesky and Pat. And we invite you to join us. We do have a meeting every Friday at 10 a.m. And we are comprised of 5 action teams. Right now we are volunteer based, but we're hoping to establish our roots here soon. If you'd like to support our work, you can go to www.navajommdr.com. And just a quick message just to leave for everyone before we close out is the culmination of this work was hard fought by our ancestors, namely our matriarchs, our Naglehe, our Dilba, and folks who have worked very hard to protect and heal our generations for like time immemorial. So our survival comes from the prayers of our ancestors, and those prayers are the strengths we use today to do this work. So in moving forward, I would encourage our entire collective to continue to put down those prayers, to continue protecting our future generations, as well as imagining a future of a community without violence and for it to be healthy. So ahihat, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Take care, adaholia, and ahihat. Bye.
Go on that, Daholia.
Go on it.